Emma Callahan pressed her hand flat against the paper to stop it from shaking. The pen in her fingers felt heavier than anything she had ever lifted. $300. That was the number written across the top of the contract. $300 for her life, her name, her future. Handed to a man she had never met, in a town she had never seen. Her mother was weeping in the corner. Emma did not look up. She signed. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, follow Emma's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 sat heavy over Millfield, Kansas, like a wool blanket soaked through with heat. The kind of heat that made animals stand still in the middle of the day and made men say things they couldn't take back. Emma Callahan had been awake since before dawn. She sat at the kitchen table in the house her father had built before the drought swallowed the last of their corn, and she stared at the paper that Silas Dunmore had left on their doorstep the night before. A contract. Simple language. Clean lines. The kind of document that looked perfectly reasonable from a distance and destroyed everything up close. Her mother, Catherine Callahan, stood at the window with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own body together. "Emma," her voice came out thin. "You don't have to." "Mama!" Emma did not look up from the paper. "We owe 4 months on this land. We owe the mill. We owe the feed store. If I don't, they take everything. The house, the animals, all of it. There has to be another way." "I've been looking for another way for 6 months." Emma finally raised her eyes. "There isn't one." Catherine pressed her knuckles against her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. Then she turned back to the window and didn't say anything else. The contract was Silas Dunmore's doing, and everyone in Millfield knew it. Dunmore was the man who held half the town's debt in his left hand and a glass of whiskey in his right. And he smiled the same way whether he was lending you money or taking your farm. He had approached Emma's mother 3 weeks earlier with what he called an arrangement. A widowed rancher 40 miles north in Silver Creek needed a housekeeper, a caretaker, someone to manage his household and raise his children. The man had 5 of them, ranging in age from 4 to 14, and no one to look after them since his wife had died the previous winter. The pay was $300 to be taken directly against the Callahan family's debt. Emma would live on the ranch. She would cook, clean, manage the children, and perform whatever duties were required of her in maintaining the household. The contract did not use the word wife, but it didn't need to. Emma understood what she was signing. She picked up the pen. "Emma, please!" Her mother spun from the window. "It's done, Mama." Emma pressed the nib to the paper and pulled her name across the line in steady cursive. Emma Rose Callahan. She set the pen down. "It's done." Ezra Cole came to collect her at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. He was a lean, sun-browned man in his late 40s, with a drooping gray mustache and the kind of quiet that came from spending most of his life outdoors. He worked for Nathaniel Holt, the rancher, and had driven the wagon 40 miles south to bring Emma back. He tipped his hat when she came out of the house with her trunk. "Miss Callahan." "Mr. Cole." He loaded her trunk without being asked. Emma stood on the porch and looked at her mother, who had come to the doorway. Catherine Callahan looked older than she had the week before. Her eyes were red and her hair was loose, and she held the door frame with both hands like she needed it to stay standing. "Write me," Emma said. Her mother nodded. She couldn't speak. Emma climbed up onto the wagon seat. She didn't look back, not because she didn't want to, because if she did, she would not leave. The road north ran through flat grassland and patches of scrub timber and crossed two shallow creek beds that were mostly dust by July. Emma and Ezra rode in silence for the first hour. The heat built steadily. The horses moved at an easy pace. Finally, Emma spoke. "Tell me about him." Ezra kept his eyes on the road. "Mr. Holt?" "Yes." Ezra turned the question over for a moment, the way a man turns a stone in his hand, before deciding whether to keep it or toss it. "He's a hard worker. Fair man. Doesn't raise his voice unless something's gone genuinely wrong." "And has something genuinely gone wrong? Lately?" A pause. "He lost his wife in February, Margaret. Fever took her, fast. 1 week she was fine, next week—" Ezra shook his head once. "Hit him hard. Hit the children hard." "What are their names?" "Thomas is the oldest, 14. Serious boy, minds his work. Then there's Clara, she's 11. Smart as a whip, and doesn't let you forget it. Then the twins, Daniel and James, they just turned 8. Then Rosie." He softened slightly on the last name, almost without meaning to. "Rosie's 4. She don't talk much anymore, since her mama passed." Emma absorbed this. "She stopped talking?" "Mostly. Says a word here and there, but she used to chatter from sunup to sundown, Margaret always said." He paused. "She don't do that anymore." Emma looked out at the passing grassland. A hawk circled in the white sky above a far ridge, slow and patient. "And Mr. Holt," she said. "Does he know I'm 19? Ezra was quiet for a beat too long. "He does," he said carefully. "Dunmore sent a letter with the particulars." "What did he say when he read it?" Ezra cleared his throat. "He said—" Another pause. "He said it was none of his business how old you were, long as you were capable." Emma nodded slowly. "That's a fair answer." "He's a fair man," Ezra said again, like it was the most important thing he knew how to say about Nathaniel Holt. Silver Creek Ranch came into view in the mid-afternoon. A cluster of buildings set back from a low ridge, surrounded by summer gold pasture and the long green line of a creek running east to west behind the barn. It was bigger than Emma had expected. The main house was 2 stories, solid built, with a wide front porch that ran the full length of the front face. The barn was newer looking than the house. The fence lines were straight and well-maintained. Ezra pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. 4 children came out of the house immediately. Emma recognized the formation. Thomas in front, deliberate and watchful. Clara beside him, examining Emma with frank, undisguised curiosity. The twins behind them, elbowing each other until Thomas shot them a look that stopped it. No Rosie. And then the door of the house opened again, and Nathaniel Holt stepped out onto the porch. He was taller than Emma had pictured, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with several days of beard and the kind of face that had been weathered into something that might have once been called handsome, if it hadn't been wearing so much grief for so long. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, though the past 6 months had added something that made him look older when his eyes were still. He came down the porch steps and stopped a few feet from the wagon. He looked at Emma without expression. Emma climbed down from the wagon seat without waiting for help. They stood facing each other in the afternoon heat. "Mr. Holt," she extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it. "Miss Callahan." His voice was low and even. "You're younger than I expected." "Dunmore's letter said 19. "It did." He let go of her hand. "I'm not saying it as a complaint. I'm saying it as a fact." "Then I'll match it with another fact," Emma said. "I've been running a household since I was 13. I know how to cook, preserve, mend, manage accounts, and settle arguments between children. My age doesn't change any of that." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. "Fair enough," he said. Thomas spoke up from behind his father. "She's smaller than Mama was." "Thomas," Nathaniel's voice carried a warning in it. "I'm just saying." Emma looked at Thomas directly. He was a tall boy, angular, with his father's dark coloring and his mother's, she guessed, stubborn jaw. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided not to like. "You're right," Emma said simply. "I am smaller than your mother was, most likely. I'm not here to be your mother. I'm here to run this house. Those are two different things, and I'd appreciate it if we kept them straight from the start." Thomas blinked. He hadn't expected that. Clara made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Clara," Emma said, turning to her. "I'm Emma." "I know," Clara said. "Ezra told us your name. I'm Clara. Those are Daniel and James. Daniel's the one with the scratch on his chin. James is the one who caused it." She delivered this last part with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to tell it to someone who would appreciate it. "And Rosie's inside. She wouldn't come out." "That's all right," Emma said. "I'll meet her when she's ready." The house was hers to manage within the hour. Nathaniel walked her through it briefly, pointing out what needed to be done and what had been let go since February. The kitchen was functional but disorganized. The larder was understocked. The boys' room was a sustained disaster. The laundry had gotten behind by at least a week. He walked her through it all with the manner of a man delivering a business report. Clear, efficient, not unkind, but not warm either. Like she was an employee, which, technically, she was. "The children eat at 6, he said. "Breakfast at 5:30 for the workdays. Sundays at 7. I take my meals with them unless I'm out on the range, in which case Ezra or one of the hands will let you know. Any questions?" "One," Emma said. He waited. "Where does Rosie sleep?" Something crossed his face, not quite pain, but adjacent to it. He recovered it quickly. "She has her own room, end of the hall, upstairs." "Does she come down for meals?" "Usually. Sometimes she has to be brought." "By you?" "Or by Thomas." Emma nodded. "I'd like to be the one to bring her down from now on, if that's all right. It'll be good for her to get used to me." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "You can try," he said. "She doesn't take to strangers easily." "Most people don't." Emma held his gaze. "Doesn't mean you stop trying." He said nothing to that. He turned and walked back toward the barn, without another word. Rosie Holt was sitting in the middle of her bedroom floor with a rag doll in her lap when Emma knocked and pushed the door open. She was tiny for 4, small-boned and pale, with a mess of brown curls and enormous gray eyes that tracked Emma from across the room with the kind of silent, absolute attention that only very small children and very old animals can manage. She did not speak. Emma did not speak either. She sat down on the floor near the door, not close enough to crowd the child, but not hovering in the doorway either, and looked around the room with genuine interest. There were drawings on the wall near the window, crayon on paper, pinned up with small tacks. They were the kind of drawings that a child makes when they are drawing the same person over and over, working out how to get the face right. All of them were the same woman, dark hair, smiling. Emma looked at the drawings for a long moment. "She's beautiful," Emma said quietly. Not to Rosie exactly, more to the room. Rosie looked at the drawings, then back at Emma. "Your mama drew those?" Emma asked. A tiny shake of the head. Rosie had drawn them herself. "You drew your mama," Emma said. That's a very good thing to do. Rosie looked down at the doll in her lap. She ran her thumb along the doll's yarn hair. Then, without looking up, she held the doll out toward Emma. Emma took it gently. She looked at it. Worn cloth body, embroidered face, a little dress that had been mended more than once. What's her name? Silence. Then, barely audible. Bess. Emma looked up. Rosie was watching her with those enormous gray eyes. That's a good name, Emma said. Strong name. She held the doll out for Rosie to take back. I think Bess is hungry. We should go down and get supper started. Rosie looked at the doll, then at Emma. Then she stood up, tucked Bess under her arm, and walked to Emma's side. She didn't take Emma's hand, but she walked close enough that their arms almost touched all the way down the stairs. Supper was a test, and Emma knew it. She had found a decent haunch of salt pork in the larder, and a sack of dried beans that hadn't yet gone stale, and she had cornbread in the oven before the children came in to wash up. It wasn't fancy. It was what the pantry allowed. Thomas sat at the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Mama made a gravy with the pork, he said. Thomas, Clara said. I'm just saying. You're always just saying, Clara muttered. Emma set the pan on the table and sat down. She looked at Thomas straight. What kind of gravy? He blinked. What? Your mama's gravy. What did she put in it? A pause. The hostility in his face shifted, just slightly, replaced by something more complicated. Onion, and she had this spice she got from the general store in town. I don't know what it was. Sage, maybe? He thought about it. Maybe. I'll try it that way next time, if you tell me if I get it close. Emma picked up her fork. Fair? Thomas looked at her for a long moment. He didn't answer, but he unfolded his arms and picked up his fork. That was enough. Nathaniel came in late from the barn and took his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. Emma had left a plate warming. He ate without comment. The twins argued across the table about something involving a frog and a boot. Clara corrected them both with the authority of a small judge. Rosie sat beside Emma and ate her cornbread in silence, occasionally glancing sideways at Emma with those watchful gray eyes. Nathaniel watched all of this from the head of the table. Emma felt his attention the way you feel a change in weather. Not unpleasant, but impossible to ignore. When the children had cleared out, she began stacking the dishes. Nathaniel stayed at the table with his coffee cup. She spoke to you, he said. Emma didn't stop moving. Rosie? Yes. Just a word or two. A long pause. She hasn't spoken more than a dozen words in 4 months. Emma set the stack of plates by the basin and turned. Children go quiet when they don't know if the world is safe anymore. She's testing it, seeing if it holds. She picked up his empty plate. It'll take time, but she'll come back. Nathaniel looked at the table. His jaw worked once. You sound certain about that. I'm not, Emma said honestly, but I act certain because she needs someone in this house to be. He looked up at her. Something in his expression was very hard to read. Like a door that had been locked for so long, the person inside had forgotten how the handle worked. Supper was good, he said finally. Emma turned back to the dishes. Thank you, Mr. Holt. Nathaniel. He pushed back his chair. We're not formal people here. He walked out without waiting for her answer. Emma stood at the basin with her hands in the warm water and stared at the wall for a moment. Nathaniel. She turned the name over once in her mind. Then she went back to the dishes. Outside, the summer night pressed against the windows, warm and dark and full of crickets, and Silver Creek Ranch settled into its first quiet since a girl from Millfield had signed her name on a line and given her future to a stranger. She had come here as a transaction. She had no idea, yet, what she would become. The first week at Silver Creek Ranch taught Emma 3 things. The first was that Thomas Holt was going to be the hardest fight she ever picked. The second was that the twins, Daniel and James, were not actually trying to destroy the house. They were simply operating under the assumption that adults would stop them before anything caught fire. The third, and the one that sat with her longest into the night, was that Nathaniel Holt moved through his own home like a man who had already said goodbye to it and just hadn't left yet. He was up before she was every morning. She would come down to find his coffee cup rinsed and turned upside down on the counter, and the back door already swinging on its hinge in the early heat. He worked from sunup to late evening and came in exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the body. He ate. He said a few words to the children. He went to bed. And he did all of it with the careful, deliberate movements of someone navigating a room full of things that might break. Emma watched him and said nothing. She had enough to do. By Wednesday, she had the kitchen organized the way she wanted it. By Thursday, she had worked out that James was the twin who lied, and Daniel was the twin who felt guilty about it afterward, which meant that when something went wrong, she needed to look at James first and wait for Daniel to break. By Friday, Clara had started following her around the house, asking questions about cooking, about herbs, about whether Emma had ever been to Kansas City, about what Emma thought of the new school teacher in Silver Creek who wore her hair in an unusual way. "I haven't met her," Emma said, working a seam on one of James's torn shirts. "I haven't been to town yet." "Papa goes every 2 weeks for supplies," Clara said. She was sitting on the edge of the kitchen table, which she had been told not to do at least 4 times. "He takes Thomas. Thomas acts like it's a great responsibility." "It is a responsibility. Thomas acts like everything is a great responsibility." Clara picked up a spool of thread and turned it in her fingers. "Even breathing." Emma kept her eyes on the seam. "He's carrying a lot." "He's 14. "Yes," Emma said. "He's 14, and his mother died 6 months ago, and his father has barely said a word since. And he's decided the only thing he can do is hold everything together himself." She looked up at Clara. "That's not being dramatic. That's being scared." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He told me you weren't going to stay." Emma's hands paused on the shirt, just for a second. "When did he say that?" "Last night, after supper. He said women like you take the money and leave when things get hard." Emma looked back down at her work. She pulled the needle through the fabric with a steady hand. "Then I guess I'll have to prove him wrong." "How?" "By staying," Emma said simply. Clara watched her for another moment. Then she put the spool down and went to wash up for supper, without being asked, for the first time since Emma had arrived. That was mini victory number 1. The rest of that evening, Thomas did not speak to Emma at all. He answered his father's questions at the table, helped James stop pouring too much salt on his beans, and cut Rosie's cornbread into pieces without being asked. He was, Emma could see clearly, a genuinely good boy, doing a genuinely terrible impression of someone who didn't care. When the table was cleared and the children had gone upstairs, Emma stopped Thomas in the hallway. "I need the axe tomorrow morning," she said. "The kindling pile's getting low." He looked at her. "I can split it." "I know you can. I'm going to split it." A flicker of something, not quite contempt, but wanting to be. "You know how to use an axe?" "My father taught me when I was 10. She held his gaze, I'll be out there at 6. If you want to show me where the good splitting rounds are, I'd appreciate it. If not, I'll figure it out." He stared at her for a long moment. "They're behind the barn," he said finally. "Left side." "Thank you, Thomas." He turned and went upstairs, but Emma noticed he didn't slam the door. Progress. The thing about Silver Creek that Emma had not expected, not from Dunmore's cold little contract, not from Ezra's careful descriptions on the wagon ride, was the way the other women in town looked at her. She found out on Saturday, when Nathaniel took the wagon into town for supplies and Emma rode with him, because the larder needed restocking, and she needed to see what the general store carried before she could plan meals for the following weeks. Silver Creek was a proper town, not large, but established enough to have a hotel, a bank, a doctor's office, and 2 competing dry goods stores. There was also, Emma noticed immediately, a particular kind of attention that followed her the moment she stepped down from the wagon. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was the kind of attention that had a whisper underneath it. She was in the general store selecting dried goods when she heard it clearly enough to understand. 2 women near the fabric bolts, speaking in the careful low voices of people who want to be heard by the right person. "That's her, the one Dunmore arranged. She's barely more than a girl. 19, I heard. Well." A pause full of implication. "Margaret Holt was a good woman." Emma picked up a tin of baking powder and read the label with great attention. "You reckon she'll last the summer?" the second voice said. "I reckon she'll last until she finds out what she actually signed up for." Emma set the tin in her basket and turned around. The 2 women looked at her. They were middle-aged, well-dressed by Silver Creek standards, with the composed expressions of people who had been caught saying true things and didn't intend to apologize for it. Emma looked at the first woman. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know if Mr. Porter stocks sage? I couldn't find it on the shelf." A beat of silence. "Second shelf from the bottom," the woman said, slightly stiffly. "Behind the bay leaves." "Thank you kindly." Emma smiled at them both, with the practiced warmth of someone raised to be polite to people who didn't deserve it, and walked to the second shelf. Behind her, she heard one of the women whisper something. She did not turn around. Nathaniel was waiting by the wagon when she came out. He took the basket from her and loaded it into the bed without comment. Then he paused. "Porter's wife say something to you?" Emma blinked. "Which one was Porter's wife?" "Gray dress, brown hair, opinion about everything." "She told me where the sage was." Nathaniel looked at her sideways. He had a way of looking sideways at things he wasn't sure about, Emma had noticed, like he preferred to approach uncertainty at an angle. "She runs the charitable society," he said. "Ran it with Margaret." "Ah." "She means well." He picked up the reins. "Most of the time." "She was worried about your children," Emma said. People who worry about children usually mean well, even when they're rude about it. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected, Miss Callahan." "You said that the first day." "I'm saying it again." He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved forward. Emma looked straight ahead at the dusty main street of Silver Creek, at the storefronts and the people going about their Saturday errands, and she thought about what those 2 women had said. Until she finds out what she actually signed up for. She wanted to ask Nathaniel what that meant. She was smart enough not to. Not yet. They were halfway home when the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind shifted, and Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins before Emma even registered the change. "Storm's moving fast," he said. Emma looked up. The clouds to the southwest were building into something serious. Not a winter storm, nothing like that, but a summer thunderstorm with real intention behind it. The kind that rolled across the Kansas plains in July like it owned everything. "How far are we?" she asked. 20 minutes if we push them." He pushed them. The horses responded, and the wagon rattled over the road at a pace that rattled Emma's teeth and required her to grip the seatboard with both hands. She didn't complain. She watched the sky and braced her feet against the floor and said nothing. The first crack of lightning split the air when they were still 10 minutes out. The horses shied. Nathaniel talked them back down with a low, steady voice. Not reassuring exactly, more commanding. The voice of a man accustomed to controlling large, frightened animals, and kept them moving. The rain hit when they were still in the yard, not quite to the barn. It came down hard and immediate, the way summer rain in Kansas does. Not gradually, just all at once, like someone turning over a bucket. Emma jumped down from the wagon before Nathaniel had it fully stopped and ran for the horses' heads, talking to them the same way she'd heard him do it, grabbing the harness to keep them steady while he got down and started unhitching. They got the horses into the barn in 3 minutes. The wagon could stay in the yard. Inside the barn, out of the rain, they stood a foot apart and caught their breath. They were both soaked. The rain hammered the roof overhead with a sound like 1,000 small fists. Nathaniel looked at her. She was dripping on the barn floor, her hair loose from its pins, her dress plastered to her arms. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know horses," Emma said. She pushed her wet hair back from her face. "My father had too. I know what they sound like when they're about to do something stupid." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Your father sounds like a practical man." He was. Past tense. She didn't explain it. He didn't ask. They stood in the loud, drumming quiet of the rain for another moment. Then he said, "I'll wait it out here. You should get back to the house. The children will be worried." Emma nodded. She looked at the barn door, measuring the distance, measuring the rain. Then she ran. She was soaked again by the time she hit the porch steps, and the door flew open before she could reach it. Clara, with her eyes wide and her face tight with the particular anxiety of a child who has learned that unexpected storms sometimes carry bad news. "You're all right," Clara said, more as a statement than a question, like she was correcting a fact she had briefly gotten wrong. "I'm all right," Emma confirmed. "Your father's in the barn. We got the horses in." Clara exhaled. She stepped back from the door to let Emma in. In the kitchen, James and Daniel were sitting at the table, playing a card game with the focused intensity of 2 boys pretending they hadn't been listening anxiously to every crack of thunder. Thomas was at the window, arms crossed, watching the rain with his father's sideways look. Rosie was under the kitchen table. Emma crouched down. Rosie had her knees pulled up, and Bess pressed against her chest and her eyes shut. She was not crying. She was simply waiting for the loud thing to stop. "Hey," Emma said softly. Rosie opened her eyes. "I'm here," Emma said. "Storm can't get in." Rosie looked at her with those gray eyes that knew too much for 4 years old. Then she shifted slightly and pressed herself against Emma's leg, not quite climbing into her lap, but close enough to feel her there. Emma stayed crouched on the kitchen floor with Rosie leaning against her, and the rain roaring on the roof, and the boys playing cards, and Thomas watching the window. And she thought, for just a moment, that this was what holding a family together felt like from the inside. Not romantic, not tidy, just present. She was so occupied with Rosie that she almost missed what Thomas said. "The Henderson boy in town," he said, still looking out the window. His voice was carefully blank. "He said people are talking." Emma straightened slightly. "Talking about what?" "About you." Thomas turned from the window. His jaw was set the way his father's was when he was working up to something. "He said his mother said you're not a housekeeper. He said people are calling you—" He stopped. "Calling me what?" Emma asked. Thomas's jaw worked. A bought woman. The kitchen went quiet. Even the twins had stopped their card game. Emma looked at Thomas for a long moment. He was watching her with those 14-year-old eyes that were trying so hard to be hard. And underneath the hardness, there was something that looked very much like shame on her behalf. Like he was furious at the people saying it, not at her, and didn't know how to separate the two. "They're not wrong," Emma said. Thomas blinked. "I signed a contract," Emma said. "That's a fact. I came here because my family needed the money. That's also a fact." She looked at him steadily. "What people do with those facts is their business. What I do with my time here is mine." "It isn't fair," Thomas said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she could see him hate it for cracking. "No," Emma agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for another moment. Something in his face was working through something. Some complicated adolescent algebra of injustice and respect and grief that Emma could see but couldn't solve for him. Then he said, very quietly, "The sage goes in at the end. That's what Mama always said. You put it in too early and it goes bitter." Emma understood immediately that this was not about cooking. "Thank you," she said. "I'll remember that." He nodded once, turned back to the window. Under the table, Rosie had fallen asleep against Emma's leg. Nathaniel came in from the barn an hour later, when the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. He found Emma at the stove, the children at the table, and Rosie asleep in the corner chair with Bess tucked under her chin. He stopped in the doorway and looked at his kitchen the way a man looks at something he's afraid to name. "Storm passed," he said. "It did," Emma agreed. He took his usual seat at the table and accepted the coffee she put in front of him without comment. He looked at the children, one by one, the way he always did when he came in from outside. A quick census, confirming everyone was accounted for. His eyes stopped on Rosie. She was still asleep in the chair, one hand curled loosely around Bess, her face relaxed in sleep in a way it rarely was when she was awake. "She hates thunder," he said, not really to Emma. "I know. She told me." Emma paused. "Not in words, but she told me." Nathaniel looked at Emma then, really looked at her. Not the sideways assessment she'd gotten used to, but a direct look that lasted several seconds and had something exposed in it that he usually kept behind the practical, efficient surface of himself. "Emma," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She kept her expression neutral. "Yes?" He seemed to consider what he was going to say. Then he said, instead of whatever he'd been about to say, "The sage. Thomas told you about the sage for the gravy." "He did." "He hasn't talked about his mother's cooking since February." Emma said nothing. "That's—" Nathaniel stopped, started again. "I want you to know that matters to me. Whatever, however this arrangement looks from the outside. What you just did, this week, it matters to me." Emma looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that easily. She could see the effort of it in the way he held himself. The slight forward lean, the hands flat on the table, like the words had weight and he was bracing against them. "I'm just doing my job," she said. It was the kindest way she could think to take the pressure off him. He nodded once, accepted it. The exposed thing in his expression retreated, but not all the way back. Some of it stayed, just at the edge of him, like a light left on in a window of an otherwise dark house. He drank his coffee. The twins argued about whose card had been whose before the storm. Rosie slept. And Thomas, Emma noticed, had moved from the window to the table and was sitting 2 chairs closer to everyone else than he usually did. It was such a small thing, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. Emma was always paying attention. She finished washing the supper dishes and listened to the last of the rain tapping on the roof overhead. And she thought about what those women in the general store had said. Until she finds out what she actually signed up for. She still didn't know, fully, what that meant. But she was starting to understand that Silver Creek Ranch was not simply a house that needed managing, and Nathaniel Holt was not simply a man who needed a housekeeper. And these 5 children were not simply a problem to be organized. They were a family, in the process of deciding whether they were still a family. And somehow, without meaning to, Emma Callahan, who had come here as a transaction, had started being part of that decision. She dried her hands on the dishcloth and looked at the dark window and tried not to think too hard about what that might cost her when the summer ended and the contract came due. She had a feeling, though she couldn't have said why, that cost was going to be higher than $300. She had a feeling it was going to be the kind of cost you paid with something you couldn't get back. 3 weeks into summer, and Emma had stopped counting the ways Silver Creek Ranch was trying to break her. She hadn't stopped fighting them, she just stopped counting. The days had settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, like things were working. The kitchen ran clean. The children were fed and clothed and present at the table. Rosie had started coming downstairs on her own every morning, Bess under her arm, and sitting in the chair closest to Emma's end of the table, without being asked. Thomas had shown Emma the sage, and then, grudgingly, the way his mother had made the biscuit dough, and then, even more grudgingly, the location of the good cast-iron skillet that someone had shoved behind the flour bin for reasons no one could explain. But there was a current running underneath all of it that Emma could feel every time Nathaniel walked through a room. Something unresolved. Something that had been sitting in this house since February and had not moved an inch despite everything she'd done. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning when Clara came running into the kitchen so fast she nearly knocked the coffee off the stove. "There's a man in the yard," Clara said. Her voice was tight. Emma turned from the stove. "What man?" "I don't know him. He's got a fancy coat. He rode in on a gray horse and he's just standing there, looking at the house." Emma already knew before she went to the window. Silas Dunmore looked exactly the way a man looked when he owned part of something and wanted you to remember it. He was dressed better than anyone in Silver Creek had reason to be on a Tuesday morning, and he stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and his eyes moving across the property with the slow, possessive satisfaction of a man taking inventory. Emma put down her spoon, untied her apron, and walked out the front door. "Mr. Dunmore?" She kept her voice even on the porch steps. "This is a long way to ride without sending word first." Dunmore smiled. He had the kind of smile that was assembled from the right parts and still came out wrong. "Miss Callahan, you're looking well. Ranch life seems to agree with you." "Was there something you needed?" "Just checking on my investment." He looked past her at the house. "Holt around?" "He's on the range." "Pity." His eyes came back to her. "I'll wait." "He won't be back until evening." "Then I'll ride out and find him." He didn't move. "Actually, Miss Callahan, there's something I wanted to discuss with you directly. Won't take a moment." Emma came down the last porch step and stopped in the yard, close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. "Then discuss it." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded paper. He held it out to her. "The arrangement we made was for 6 months," he said. "Room, board, household management. In exchange for the retirement of your family's debt." Emma took the paper. She unfolded it. It was a copy of the original contract, her own signature at the bottom, with a line she had not remembered, or had not read carefully enough, near the middle of the second page. In the event that either party finds the arrangement unsuitable prior to the completion of the agreed term, the unpaid portion of the outstanding debt shall revert to the original creditor. She read it twice. The debt isn't cleared until the 6 months are up, she said, not a question. Paid out over time, Dunmore agreed pleasantly. Monthly installments, in effect, against your service rendered. You've completed approximately 1 month, which means, if you were to leave before the term concluded, the remaining amount would remain outstanding. He tilted his head. Against your mother's property. Emma folded the paper. She looked at Dunmore's assembled smile. I wasn't planning to leave. Of course not. He tucked his hands back in his vest pockets. Just wanted to be sure we were clear on the terms. A woman in your position benefits from knowing exactly where she stands. A woman in my position, Emma said, benefits from knowing exactly what a man like you is actually saying. She held his gaze. You came 40 miles to remind me I can't leave. That means someone told you I might want to. Something flickered in Dunmore's eyes. Not quite annoyance, more like recalibration. He hadn't expected that. Give my regards to Holt, he said, and turned back to his horse. Emma stood in the yard and watched him ride out. She held the folded contract in her hand and kept her face still until he was through the gate and gone. Then she turned back to the house and found Thomas standing in the doorway. He had heard every word. She could see it in his face, the way the color had drained out of it and been replaced with something white-hot and furious. He was gripping the doorframe with one hand. He looked younger and older at the same time, the way children do when they learn something about the world that they shouldn't have to know yet. He can't do that, Thomas said. His voice was shaking. He can. Emma walked up the steps. The contract says so. Then the contract is legal, Emma said. Unpleasant, but legal. She stopped in front of him. Thomas, look at me. He looked at her. His jaw was working, and his eyes were bright with something he was furious at himself for feeling. I'm not leaving, she said. Not because of him. Not because of a contract. I'm not leaving because I don't want to. She paused. Do you understand the difference? He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, thick-voiced, Why are you telling me that? Because you're the one standing here, she said simply. Now go bring me more firewood. I need the stove hotter. He went. He didn't say anything else. But when he came back with the firewood, he set it down carefully instead of dropping it, which was new. She told herself it was enough. She almost believed it. She did not tell Nathaniel about Dunmore's visit that evening. She turned it over while she made supper, testing it from different angles, asking herself whether she was protecting him from something or protecting herself from having the conversation. She couldn't decide. So she put the folded contract at the bottom of her trunk, and she set the biscuits on the table, and she looked at Nathaniel across the length of the kitchen and said nothing. He knew something was wrong. She could see him sensing it, the same way he'd sensed the weather changing on the road, that slight tightening, that shift of attention. He looked at her twice during supper, with the sideways look that had started to feel familiar, and both times she looked back at him with the neutral expression she'd been practicing since she was 13 and didn't want her mother to see her cry. He let it go. That night, he did not let it go. The next morning, she was in the yard before 6, splitting kindling the way she had promised Thomas she would. The air was still cool, the light still low and golden. The only sounds the axe and the birds, and somewhere in the distance, one of the hands calling to another. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back, and she was working through the rounds with a rhythm that kept her mind from working too hard on things she couldn't fix. She heard the screen door, and then his boots on the porch, and then the sound of him coming across the yard, and she kept splitting. Dunmore was here yesterday, Nathaniel said. Emma drove the axe into the chopping block. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? She turned and faced him. He was standing 6 feet away with his arms at his sides and his expression carefully controlled. But she had been watching his face for 3 weeks, and she could see past the control now. There was something that looked like it might be anger underneath, but it was pointed at the wrong place. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself for not being there. I handled it, Emma said. That's not the point. It seemed like the point to me. Emma. His voice had dropped into the low, direct register that usually meant the end of the patient version of himself. He is not a safe man. If he rode out here personally to deliver whatever he delivered, then it was meant to intimidate you, and I should have— What? Emma picked up the axe again. Been here? Sent him away yourself? She looked at him. I'm not going to run to you every time someone wants me to feel small, Nathaniel. I handled it. It's handled. What did he say? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she told him about the contract clause. All of it. Nathaniel went very still. Emma watched the stillness move through him. The way it started at his jaw and went down through his shoulders and into his hands, which had closed slowly at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet in the particular way that was worse than loudness. He came here to remind you that you can't leave, he said. Yes. And you haven't said anything to me. I wasn't sure what to say. You could have said exactly what you just told me. He looked at her. Not sideways this time. Straight on. I would have gone after him. I know. Emma set the axe down. That's part of why I didn't tell you. He absorbed that. She could see him working through it. This man who carried everything forward and backward, and never put any of it down. And she thought she could actually see the moment he understood what she meant. That she had protected him from the particular fury of finding out someone had threatened her. Because she had seen what happened to this family when Nathaniel Holt spent his energy on anger instead of living. That isn't your job, he said quietly. No, Emma agreed. I reckon it isn't. They stood there in the early morning air with the axe between them, and all the things neither of them was saying, pressing against the inside of the silence. Then Rosie's voice came from the porch, clear, small, carrying. Emma, Bess is hungry. They both turned. Rosie was standing on the top porch step in her nightdress, with Bess in her arms, her brown curls loose around her face, looking at Emma with the patient authority of a 4-year-old who did not understand why breakfast had not yet happened. Emma looked back at Nathaniel. Something had broken open in his expression, a fault line running right through the middle of the controlled surface, and underneath it was the face of a man who hadn't expected his daughter's voice to sound like that, like it used to. Go, he said. His voice was rough. Emma went. She was halfway to the porch when she heard him pick up the axe behind her and start splitting wood with considerably more force than was strictly necessary. She thought that was probably fine. The town of Silver Creek made its move on a Friday. Emma should have seen it coming. The signs had been there. The sideways looks on her one trip to the general store. The careful silence when she'd approached the counter. The fact that Ezra had come back from town on Wednesday with the supply run and spent the entire unloading process not quite making eye contact with her. She was weeding the kitchen garden when they came. 3 women, in a buckboard, driving into the yard with the composed determination of a delegation. She recognized Porter's wife, the gray dress, the brown hair, and 2 others she didn't know but could identify by type. Women who organize things. Important things. The kind of important things that were almost always about other people's business. Emma stood up from the garden and brushed the dirt from her hands and waited. Porter's wife, her name, Emma would learn, was Mrs. Helen Greer, stepped down from the buckboard with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to making entrances, and came to stand before Emma with the expression of someone who had rehearsed what she was about to say and intended to say all of it. "Miss Callahan," she said, "I'll come directly to the point." "Please," Emma said. "The community has a concern about this arrangement." Mrs. Greer clasped her hands in front of her. "Mr. Holt is a respected member of this town. His late wife, Margaret, was well loved. There is a feeling among the women of Silver Creek that an arrangement of this nature, a young unmarried woman living in the household of a widower, sets a troubling precedent, and that the Holt children deserve a more formal situation." Emma looked at her steadily. "What kind of formal situation?" "The Henderson family has expressed willingness to take the children," Mrs. Greer said. "Temporarily, while Mr. Holt—" "No." Mrs. Greer blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No," Emma said again. She was surprised by how calm her own voice was. Something had gone very still inside her, the same way it had when she'd picked up the pen above that contract. "Those children are not going anywhere. They are in their home. They are fed and clothed and loved, and they are starting to come back to themselves after losing their mother." She paused. "You are not taking them." The second woman spoke up. "It isn't your decision to make." "It's Mr. Holt's decision," Emma said, "and I'm confident in what that decision will be." "Mr. Holt," Mrs. Greer said carefully, "may not be thinking clearly about what is appropriate." "What's inappropriate," Emma said, "is 3 women driving onto a man's property to discuss taking his children without speaking to him first." She held Mrs. Greer's gaze. "You want to raise a concern? You go find Nathaniel. I'll tell you exactly where he's working today." She didn't move. "But I want you to understand something before you go." Mrs. Greer waited. "Those children know my name," Emma said. "They sit at the table and they eat and they argue and they sleep through the night. That little girl at the end of the hall went 4 months without speaking more than 10 words, and this morning she called to me from the porch." Her voice stayed even. She made sure of it. "You can question my age. You can question this arrangement. You can say everything you want to say about what this looks like. But you will not tell me those children would be better off somewhere else. Because you'd be wrong. And somewhere underneath all of this, I think you know it." The yard was absolutely silent. One of the other women was looking at Emma with an expression that had shifted. Not quite respect yet, but close to it. Something reconsidering. Mrs. Greer looked at Emma for a long moment. Something moved in the woman's face. Some internal argument that Emma was not privy to. Then she said, very quietly, "Margaret Holt was my closest friend." Emma absorbed this. "I know." "She loved those children more than anything in this world." "I know that too." Emma did not soften, but she let something human into her voice. "I'm not trying to replace her. I never could. But somebody in that house has to be certain, Mrs. Greer. And right now, I'm the one who's there." Helen Greer looked at her for another long moment. Then she looked at the house. Her eyes moved upward to the second-floor window where, Emma would notice only later when she thought back on it, Rosie was standing watching, with Bess held against her chest. Something in Mrs. Greer's expression collapsed and rebuilt itself into something quieter. "I'll speak to Nathaniel," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Emma said. They left without saying anything more. Emma stood in the yard and watched them go, and held herself perfectly still until the buckboard had turned out of the gate and the dust had started to settle. Then her knees went briefly unreliable, and she put her hand on the fence post and waited it out. She had not known she was going to say any of that until she said it. She had not known how much she meant it until the words were already out. She stood at the fence with the summer heat pressing down on her shoulders, and she thought, slowly and with great precision, about what she had just admitted to herself. Those children were not an assignment anymore. They were hers. Not in contract, not in any way she could explain to Silas Dunmore or Helen Greer or anyone who wanted to talk about arrangements and formal situations. Just hers. In the way that something becomes yours when you've worried about it in the dark and held it when it was frightened and learned the particular weight of it in your arms. She was still standing at the fence when Thomas came around the side of the house with a bucket in his hand and stopped short at the sight of her face. "What happened?" he said immediately. "Some women from town," Emma said. "It's handled." Thomas set the bucket down. "What women?" "Mrs. Greer, 2 others." She watched his face go through recognition and then through something colder. "She came here?" His voice had gotten very quiet. "She came here to take us?" "She came here to talk about it." Emma turned from the fence to face him. "I talked back." He stared at her. Then, without warning, his composure cracked. The 14-year-old armor he wore so carefully split right down the middle. And what came through was not anger, but fear, raw and exposed and real. "They can't take Rosie," he said. His voice broke on the name. She just started getting better." "Thomas." Emma stepped forward and put her hand on his arm. He went rigid for a second, the way boys do when they haven't been touched in a long time and don't know what to do with it. "Listen to me. No one is taking anyone. Do you hear me? I will stand in that yard every single day if I have to." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Why?" he said. And it was the real question. Not about Mrs. Greer, not about the town. About her. About why Emma Callahan, who had come here as a transaction, was standing in this yard like it was a hill worth dying on. Emma didn't have a clean answer for him, so she gave him the true one. "Because it matters," she said. "And because you all matter. And because someone in this house has to act like they know that, and right now, I'm the one who's here." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. His eyes were wet, and he was furious about it. Then he picked up his bucket and said, voice rough, "I'm telling Papa." "Tell him," Emma said. He went. She turned back to the fence and the open Kansas summer and tried to put herself back together before Nathaniel came in from the range. She was mostly successful. But that evening, when Nathaniel came to find her in the kitchen after the children were in bed, his face carrying everything that Thomas had told him, and something else underneath it that was even older and more complicated, she looked at him across the table and felt the last of her armor go quiet. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at her the way he'd looked at his sleeping daughter from the barn doorway, like something he hadn't let himself want in a very long time, and was not sure he had the right to. "Emma," he said. "Nathaniel." "I owe you." "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you an honest conversation." He held her gaze. "One I should have had 3 weeks ago." She sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet. The house above them was quiet. Outside, the summer night made its steady sounds: crickets, wind, the distant low of a cow. "Then have it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, like a man gathering something from a long distance. "Margaret's been gone 6 months," he said. "And I have—" He stopped, started again. I have been trying to hold this together by keeping myself somewhere outside of it. Coming in, doing what needs doing, going back out. Because if I... His jaw tightened. If I stopped moving, I thought I might not be able to start again. Emma didn't speak. And then you walked into this yard, he said. And you talked back to my 14-year-old son, like he was a man worth arguing with. And you sat on the floor with my daughter until she trusted you enough to say one word. And you stood in my yard today and told Helen Greer to her face that my children aren't going anywhere. He paused. And I am sitting here right now trying to figure out how to... He stopped. Emma waited. How to say thank you, he finished, without it sounding like what it actually is. What is it actually? Emma asked carefully. He looked at her for a long time. Across the kitchen table, with the quiet house around them and the summer pressing in at the windows. I don't know yet, he said honestly. But it isn't nothing. Emma held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. No, she said quietly. It isn't nothing. They sat with that for a moment. Two people on either side of something that had no clean name yet. Something that had been building for 3 weeks in kitchens and yards and wagon rides and storm-dark barns. Something that neither of them had asked for, and neither of them was ready to stop. Then Nathaniel said, in a voice that was working hard to stay even, Dunmore's contract. Emma went still. I'm tearing it up, he said. I'll settle the debt with your mother myself, directly. You're not here because of that paper. Not anymore. Emma stared at him. Nathaniel, I mean it. His eyes were steady. You're here because I want you here. Because this family needs you here. That's the only arrangement I'm willing to have. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Emma had ever sat inside. She opened her mouth. She had a practical response ready. About the money. About what that meant. About what he was offering and what it would cost him. But what came out was just, all right. He nodded once. He got up. He went to bed. Emma sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after that, with the summer night around her and Nathaniel Holt's voice still in the room. And she thought about a girl who had pressed her hand flat against a paper to keep it from shaking, and how very far she was from that morning, and how completely she had walked, without meaning to, without knowing, without any map at all, into the exact center of something she did not yet have a word for. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of a girl signing her name on a line. In the dream, the girl was smiling. The morning after Nathaniel tore up Dunmore's contract, Emma woke up before dawn and lay in the dark for a full 5 minutes, asking herself what exactly she had agreed to. Not the practical part. She understood the practical part. He would pay her mother's debt directly, the contract was void, she was no longer bound by anything written on paper. That part was clear. What was not clear was what she was bound by instead, and whether she had the sense to be frightened of it. She got up. She went downstairs. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the early light come up over the ridge, and she thought about Nathaniel's voice the night before. You're here because I want you here. And decided that the most honest thing she could do was act like nothing had changed until she knew what had. So that is what she did. She made breakfast. She called the children down. She split the difference between who she had been yesterday and who she suspected she was becoming. And she held that line the way you hold a fence post in wet ground, with both hands and no guarantee it would stay. Nathaniel came in from the barn at 5:30 like always. He poured his coffee like always. He sat at the table and said good morning to the children like always. He looked at Emma once across the kitchen, and in that look was everything they had said the night before, and also the mutual, unspoken agreement not to say it again, yet. Emma put his plate in front of him. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Clara looked between them with the sharp eyes of an 11-year-old who missed nothing and filed everything away for later use. She said nothing. But Emma caught her expression and recognized it. It was the expression of someone watching a door that had been shut for a long time begin, very slowly, to open. The shift in the house was not dramatic. That was the thing Emma hadn't expected. That change, real change, the kind that matters, doesn't arrive like a storm. It arrives the way the light changes in July, so gradually that you look up one afternoon and realize everything looks different, and you can't say exactly when it happened. Thomas stopped waiting to be told things. He started asking. He came to Emma one morning while she was kneading bread and said, without preamble, "Ezra says the east fence line needs mending before the cattle rotation next week. Papa hasn't said anything about it. Should I bring it up or just do it?" Emma kept working the dough. "What do you think?" "I think I should just do it. But I don't want to—" He stopped. "Overstep?" Emma said. "He gets—" Thomas paused again, choosing his words carefully. "He gets quiet when someone does something he thinks he should have done himself." Emma turned to look at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his thumbs in his belt loops, the posture of a boy trying to stand like a man. And she thought about what it had cost him, all these months of managing everyone and everything, filling the gaps his father had left when grief had taken most of Nathaniel out of commission. "Tell him tonight," Emma said. "Tell him you noticed it and ask if he wants your help. Don't just do it." Thomas frowned. "Why?" "Because your father needs to feel useful in his own house," Emma said quietly. "He's been somewhere else for 6 months. He's starting to come back. Let him come back to something." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's—" He seemed reluctant to say it. "That's what Mama used to do. She'd find things for him to fix," said he thought better when his hands were working. Emma looked at the bread dough. "She sounds like she was a smart woman." She was. His voice was plain, not grief-strangled anymore, just honest. Like speaking about Margaret Holt had gone from being an injury to being a fact. That alone was worth more than Emma could measure. He told Nathaniel about the fence at supper. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment, and Emma watched something pass between them. A recognition, quiet and significant. And then Nathaniel said, "Ride out with me Saturday. We'll assess it together." Thomas nodded. He picked up his fork. Emma saw his shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the way shoulders do when a weight lifts. Under the table, Rosie pressed her foot against Emma's, which was how she indicated, without words, that she was pleased with how things were going. Emma pressed back. The second shift came from a direction Emma hadn't anticipated. Helen Greer. She came alone this time, on a Wednesday morning, with no buckboard and no delegation. Just a horse and a basket over her arm, and an expression that had left its rehearsed qualities somewhere on the road from town. Emma met her in the yard. "I won't stay long," Mrs. Greer said. She held out the basket. "I brought preserves. The children used to like Margaret's blackberry preserves, and I made extra this year and—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together briefly. "I came to apologize, Miss Callahan." Emma took the basket. "You don't have to." "I do." Mrs. Greer looked at her steadily, not the evaluating look of their first meeting, but something more direct and more tired. "I behaved as though your being here was the problem. It wasn't. I was—" Another pause. "I was grieving, and I took it out in the wrong direction. Margaret would have told me so herself, and loudly." Emma looked at the woman. This woman who had driven a buckboard into the yard 3 weeks ago with the best and worst intentions wrapped together, who had been Margaret Holt's closest friend, who had probably sat in this yard 100 times before Emma existed, and had no language yet for what the yard looked like with a stranger in it. "She sounds like she was direct," Emma said. Helen Greer's mouth curved, brief and sad. "Insufferably. I miss it every day." She looked at the house. "How are they, really?" Emma considered the honest answer. "Thomas is learning to ask for help instead of just carrying things. Clara's going to run something someday. I'm just not sure what. The twins broke 2 fence posts last week, but they felt terrible about it, which I consider progress. And Rosie—" She stopped. Mrs. Greer was watching her face. "Rosie sang yesterday," Emma said. "Just a few words. A song Margaret must have sung to her. She was in the kitchen, and I heard her, and I stood in the hallway and didn't move because I didn't want her to stop." Helen Greer pressed 2 fingers against her mouth. She did not speak for a moment. "That's the best thing I've heard," she said finally, in a voice she was holding together carefully. "In 6 months." Emma nodded. "I thought you'd want to know." Mrs. Greer straightened. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, a composing gesture, deliberate and practiced. "If there is anything this household needs from town, Miss Callahan, I would like to be the person you ask." Emma looked at her. "That's a generous offer. It's a practical one." Helen Greer's chin was up. "Margaret would haunt me otherwise." She turned back to her horse. "Good morning, Miss Callahan." "Good morning, Mrs. Greer." Emma stood in the yard with the basket of blackberry preserves and watched Helen Greer ride back toward Silver Creek, and thought that grief did something interesting to people. It either made them smaller, or it made them honest. And sometimes, if they had enough in them, it eventually made them both. She took the preserves inside. That evening at supper, when she set a jar on the table, Thomas saw the label and went very still. Emma watched him recognize the handwriting. Margaret's, presumably, from a previous year's jar still in the cellar, and then realize it wasn't Margaret's. Similar, but different. Someone who had been paying close attention. "Mrs. Greer made them," Emma said. "She brought them this morning." Thomas looked at the jar for a moment. Then he looked up at his father. Nathaniel was also looking at the jar, with the expression he got when something reached past the controlled surface and got to the part of him that hadn't fully come back yet. "She make them the same way?" Daniel asked. He and James had the pure, practical interest of 8-year-olds, for whom blackberry preserves were simply blackberry preserves. "Open it and tell me," Emma said. Daniel pried the lid up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given permission to destroy something small. He stuck his finger in immediately, the way he always did, before Emma could suggest a spoon. "Same," he announced. James verified this by the same method. "Better, maybe." "You can't tell from your finger," Clara said. "I have a very good finger," James said seriously. The table erupted in the particular kind of argument that was not really an argument, the kind where everyone is laughing underneath the indignation. Emma reached across and pushed the jar toward the center of the table, and caught Nathaniel's eyes in the process. He was watching the table with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open, unguarded, almost bewildered. Like a man who had been bracing for impact for so long that the sudden absence of it was its own kind of shock. She looked away before he caught her looking. Later became its own problem. It started small, the way things do when you're living in close quarters with someone, and the boundaries you both set early on begin to blur at the edges. He started coming in from the barn earlier. Not much, 20 minutes, half an hour. But she noticed, because she noticed everything about this household, and what had changed and what hadn't. He started sitting at the table after supper with his coffee, instead of taking it to the porch. He started talking to the children at dinner, instead of through dinner. Asking Thomas about the fence assessment. Asking Clara about the letter she was writing to her school friend in Abilene. Asking the twins questions he already knew the answers to, just to hear them answer. He was coming back. She could see it happening, and the part that she had not prepared herself for was how much it moved her. The moment it became impossible to ignore came on a Thursday evening, 10 days after the contract. Emma was at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, working through the household accounts, the actual record-keeping, the kind she'd taken over after Nathaniel had shown her, with slight embarrassment, the complete disorder his spending ledger had descended into since February. She had the ledger open and a pencil in her hand, and she was working through 3 months of unrecorded expenditures when she heard his boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen, saw her at the table, and stopped. "You're still up," he said. "Accounts," she said, without looking up. "Someone let 4 months of feed purchases go unrecorded." He paused. "Occupied." "I know." She made a mark in the ledger. "It's almost sorted. Sit down. I need to ask you about 2 purchases from the mill in May that I can't identify." He sat. He looked at the ledger from across the table. He answered her questions. The mill purchases were for timber he'd bought to reinforce the barn roof before summer, paid in 2 installments. And she recorded the answers, and he watched her write with the expression she had been trying not to notice him wearing lately. "You have good numbers sense," he said. "My father taught me." She kept writing. "He said a woman who can't read her own accounts is a woman who can be cheated." "Smart man." "Very." She closed the ledger. "He died 2 years ago. That's why the farm was struggling. He managed everything, and he didn't teach Mama in time." She said it plainly, without drama, because she had made peace with it the way you make peace with something you cannot change, fully and slowly, and not without cost. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She looked up at him. "I don't say it for sympathy. I say it so you understand that I know what it looks like when a family loses the person holding it together. I know what the afterward looks like." He held her gaze. "Is that why you're still here? After everything Dunmore pulled, after Helen Greer came with her delegation, after everything this house has thrown at you? Nathaniel, is that why?" Emma set her pencil down. She looked at this man, this honest, difficult, grief-worn man, with his careful sideways looks, and his children who were starting to laugh again. And she decided that if she was going to live in this house and mean what she said about it, she was going to have to stop pretending she didn't know the answer to that question. "No," she said. "That's not why." He waited. "I stay because I want to," she said. "Because this is—" She stopped, started again. "Because when I'm here, I feel like I'm standing on ground that's worth standing on. And I haven't felt that in a long time." She paused. "That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "That's not a small thing." "No," Emma agreed. "It isn't." They sat with that. The kitchen around them was warm and still, the lamp low, the accounts ledger closed between them. And Emma thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had sat at a table once and signed her name on a line and thought she was giving her future away. And she had been wrong. She had not been giving it away. She had been sending it somewhere she didn't know how to find on her own. She had found it here, in this kitchen, in this house. She had found it in the weight of a 4-year-old girl pressing her foot against Emma's under a supper table, and in a 14-year-old boy explaining the proper use of sage. And in the specific way one man looked at her from across a room when he thought she wasn't watching. She was always watching. That was when Dunmore came back. Not in person. Worse than in person. A letter, delivered by Ryder on a Friday morning while Nathaniel was out, and Emma was the only adult on the property. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it, and felt the same cold clarity she'd felt the first time he'd stood in this yard. She opened it. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Nathaniel, and she read it because it had been opened. Deliberately opened, she realized. The seal broken cleanly, which meant whoever had delivered it had intended her to read it. That was Dunmore's particular brand of cruelty. He did things in the sequence that caused the most damage. The letter had 3 parts. The first was a polite reminder that the original debt arrangement, the one Nathaniel believed he had settled by tearing up the contract, had not, in fact, been settled, because Dunmore had registered a secondary lien against the Callahan property at the county recorder's office before the arrangement was ever presented to Emma. The tear of the contract voided his agreement with Holt, but the lien remained. The second was a statement that Emma's mother had received notice of foreclosure proceedings, effective in 30 days, against the Millfield property. The third was an offer. Nathaniel could prevent the foreclosure by purchasing the lien outright. The price was twice what the property was worth. Emma read the letter twice. She folded it. She sat down in the kitchen chair and stared at the far wall, and let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full weight of it. The way he had planned this, the way he had let her believe the contract was done, let her feel the relief of it, let Nathaniel feel the dignity of having settled it, and then waited for the moment it would hurt the most to pull the floor out. 60 seconds. Then she stood up. She needed to tell Nathaniel. She needed to tell him before her mother received anything else from Dunmore. Before 30 days became 29, became 15. She needed to tell him the truth, all of it, including the part she had not said, which was that her mother's property was the only thing standing between Catherine Callahan and having nowhere to go. She was halfway to the door when Thomas came through it. He saw her face and stopped. What happened? Emma handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face go through the same sequence hers had. Comprehension, then cold fury, then the particular stillness of someone deciding what to do with the fury. He planned this, Thomas said. Yes. From the beginning. From the beginning. Thomas looked up from the letter. His eyes were very steady. He looked, in that moment, less like a 14-year-old boy than like the man he was somewhere in the process of becoming. I'll go find Papa. Thomas, I'll find him. He was already moving. Don't go anywhere. He was out the door and onto a horse in under 2 minutes. Emma had not finished thinking about whether to go after him before he was already gone. She went back to the kitchen. She put the letter on the table. She put the kettle on, because she needed to do something with her hands, and she stood at the stove and thought about her mother. Small, tired Catherine Callahan in the house Emma had grown up in, receiving a notice in Dunmore's handwriting and understanding almost none of what it meant legally, but understanding all of what it meant in the way that mattered. She thought about the look on her mother's face the morning Emma had driven away, the hands on the doorframe, the inability to speak. Emma pressed her hand flat on the counter the same way she had pressed it on that contract, and she made herself a promise that had nothing to do with Nathaniel Holt or Silver Creek Ranch or anything written on any piece of paper. She was not going to let Dunmore win this, whatever it cost. Nathaniel came in from the range 45 minutes later, with Thomas right behind him, both of them moving at the pace of people who have been riding hard and have not yet slowed down in their heads. Nathaniel picked up the letter from the table before he sat down. He read it, standing up. Thomas stood in the doorway. The silence in the kitchen was the particular kind that precedes a decision. Nathaniel set the letter down. He looked at Emma. "When did this arrive?" "This morning, while you were out." "You read it?" "It was already opened." Emma held his gaze. "He wanted me to read it before you did. He thought it would—" She paused. "He thought it would make me fold." Nathaniel looked at the letter again. "Your mother's property?" "Yes." "And if I buy out the lien—" "He wins twice," Emma said. "He gets the money, and he gets the satisfaction." "I don't care about his satisfaction." Nathaniel's voice was very quiet. "I care about your mother losing her home." Emma stared at him. "Nathaniel, that's twice the property value. You can't—" "I'll go to Silver Creek Monday morning," he said. "Talk to the bank. Look at the land holdings." He folded the letter. "What does your mother's property carry?" 20 acres, good soil, a well." Emma's voice felt strange in her throat. "Nathaniel, you can't put this ranch at risk for—" "I'm not putting anything at risk." He set the letter on the table and looked at her fully, directly, no angles. "I'm doing what needs doing. That's all." He paused. "That's all it ever is." Emma stood across the table from him and felt something give way inside her that she had been keeping rigid for a very long time. Not collapse. She did not collapse. But give way, the way ground gives way under something heavy, settling into a new and permanent shape. Thomas was watching them from the doorway. Emma glanced at him. He was looking at his father with an expression that she recognized. The expression of a boy who has been waiting for a long time to see his father look like himself, and is watching it happen. "Papa," Thomas said. Nathaniel turned. "The east fence is ready," Thomas said. "When you want to check it." Nathaniel looked at his son for a moment. Something passed between them, wordless, loaded, the kind of communication that exists only between people who have been carrying the same weight for a long time and are finally, slowly, setting it down together. "Tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "First light." Thomas nodded. He pushed off the door frame and went upstairs. Emma began clearing the table. Her hands were steady. She was not going to let them be otherwise. She stacked the cups and picked up the letter and set it on the shelf where she kept the household papers. And she did all of it without looking at Nathaniel. He hadn't moved from the table. "Emma," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the same expression he'd had in the kitchen 10 days ago. Open, unguarded, slightly bewildered, but closer now, less held back. Like whatever door had been opening had opened another degree. "I'm glad Thomas told me," he said, "about the fence, about going to find me today." He paused. "He said you told him to come." "I handed him the letter," Emma said. "He made his own decision." "Still." She waited. "You're making them braver," he said. "All of them. You're—" He stopped, and she could see him searching for the word. This man who worked in actions and not in language, who communicated better with his hands and his presence than with sentences. "You're making this family brave again. And I want you to know I see it." Emma looked at him. "I see it too," she said quietly. "I see it in you." He was still. The kitchen was still, and in the room above them, she could hear, very faintly, almost too faint to be sure it was real, the thin, sweet sound of a 4-year-old girl singing 2 lines of a song she had learned from her mother, over and over in the near dark, like a small light being kept alive against the night. Neither of them moved. They just listened. And that, Emma thought, that sound, That tiny, brave sound from the end of the hall upstairs was what winning looked like. Not clean, not easy, not the way she'd imagined anything from the yard of a house in Millfield, Kansas, with a pen in her hand and her whole life on a line. But real. Real and warm and hers. Rosie was still singing when Emma finally went to bed that night. Not loudly. Not the way a child sings when she wants to be heard. The way a child sings when she has forgotten to be afraid. Quietly, to herself, in the dark. Because the sound is a comfort, and the world has started to feel safe enough to make it. Emma lay in her room with the sound coming through the wall, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Dunmore's letter sitting on the shelf downstairs, and about Catherine Callahan in a house 40 miles south, and about Nathaniel Holt's hands flat on the kitchen table saying, "I'll do what needs doing," like it was the simplest sentence in the English language. She did not sleep well. But for the first time since she had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, the sleeplessness was not fear. It was something else entirely. Something that felt uncomfortably and undeniably like hope. Nathaniel left for Silver Creek at first light Monday morning. He told Emma at breakfast, straightforward and brief. He was going to the bank. He would be back by afternoon. Thomas was in charge of the boys, and Clara knew where everything was. He said it the same way he said everything practical. And then he looked at Emma and added, "I'll stop at the telegraph office. Send your mother a message. Tell her to expect a letter from me directly." Emma had not asked him to do that. "Nathaniel, she'll be worried," he said simply. "She should know someone's handling it." He went before she could argue. Clara appeared at Emma's elbow approximately 4 seconds after the door closed. "He went to deal with Dunmore, didn't he?" "He went to the bank." "Same thing." Clara picked up a biscuit and assessed it with the gravity of someone conducting official business. "Thomas told me about the letter." "Of course he did." "Thomas tells me everything eventually. He just pretends he doesn't." Clara looked at Emma sideways. The same sideways look as her father, Emma had noticed weeks ago. Something inherited in the angle of it. "Are you scared?" Emma considered the honest answer. "A little." "Of Dunmore?" "Of what it costs to stop him." She looked at Clara. "That's the thing about men like Dunmore. They don't actually want the money. They want you to feel the weight of choosing between things that matter." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to choose?" "I'm going to choose this house," Emma said. "Same as I have been." Clara looked at her for a long moment with those sharp 11-year-old eyes. Then she put the biscuit down and said, "I'm going to go make sure the twins haven't done anything to the chickens." She left. Emma stood at the kitchen window and watched the morning and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. It always was. Thomas managed the morning with the precise, contained competence of someone who had been rehearsing for exactly this kind of responsibility for months. He had the twins doing actual, useful work by 8 o'clock, a feat Emma had not yet fully accomplished, and he checked the water troughs and the garden fence, and came back into the kitchen at 10 to report on all of it, like a foreman giving a work summary. Emma looked at him over the report. "You know you don't have to account for all of it." "I want to," he said. "I want him to come back and know it ran right." Emma understood. "He'll know," she said. "He already knows." Thomas's jaw worked briefly. "What if the bank won't?" "Then we find another way." "What other way?" Emma met his eyes. "I don't know yet. But I found that if you're willing to keep looking, there's usually one." She paused. "Your father is willing to keep looking. So am I. That's enough." He stood there for a moment, this boy who had been holding the weight of this family on his 14-year-old back since February. and Emma could see the exact moment he decided. Not to put the weight down, but to share it, to let it be distributed across more than one set of shoulders. It was a small moment, the kind that doesn't make noise. But Emma had been paying attention to small moments for long enough to know they were the ones that lasted. Nathaniel came back at 2 in the afternoon, earlier than expected. Emma heard the horse in the yard and came to the door and read his face before he was off the saddle. Composed, deliberate, the look of a man who had done a difficult thing and come out the other side of it. He came into the kitchen. He sat down. He accepted the coffee Emma put in front of him without comment. "Well?" Emma said. "Lens cleared," he said. Emma set the coffee pot down. "How?" "Henderson at the bank." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Turns out Dunmore has been running similar arrangements across 3 counties. Henderson knew it and had been waiting for someone to come in with standing to challenge it. I gave him the letter. He's referring it to the county attorney." He paused. "Dunmore can still file, technically, but he won't. Not with the county attorney already looking at his books." Emma stared at him. "You went in there expecting to buy out the lien and came out with him under investigation?" "I went in there prepared for whatever it took." He looked at her steadily. "Turns out what it took was less than I planned for." Emma sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd made the morning of the contract, the same table-steadying reflex, and she breathed out slowly. "My mother's property is safe," she said. "Your mother's property is safe." Emma looked at the table. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about saying something, and could not find any arrangement of words that was adequate to what she was feeling. So she said nothing at all. And Nathaniel sat across from her, and let the silence be what it was. Then, from upstairs, came the sound of something being knocked over, followed immediately by 2 voices ascending in volume and accusation. Emma and Nathaniel looked at each other. "The twins," Emma said. "Yes." A pause. "They're yours," he said. There was something in his voice when he said it, not quite a smile, but the breath before one. Emma pushed back her chair. "They are absolutely not mine." She went upstairs. The look on his face followed her all the way up. The rest of that week moved differently. Something had broken loose in the house. Some last stubborn thing that had been frozen in place since February had cracked open in the summer heat and was finally, slowly, thawing out. Nathaniel was present in a way he hadn't been before. Not just physically, not just at the table. Present in the actual sense. The kind that meant he was in the room rather than near it. He watched the children. He talked to them. He asked Thomas about the fence and actually listened to the full answer. He taught Daniel to carve a whistle from a green stick on a Saturday afternoon, and let James ruin 2 sticks in the learning process without comment. And he kept finding reasons to be wherever Emma was. She noticed it the way you notice a change in the wind. Not the thing itself, but the effect of it. He came into the kitchen while she was cooking and stayed to talk. He asked her questions about the household accounts, which she now understood, and listened to her answers as though they were interesting. He sat on the porch in the evenings after supper, which he hadn't done since she'd arrived. And if she was there, he sat near her rather than at the other end. He had not said anything about what they'd said in the kitchen 10 days ago. It isn't nothing, and neither had she. But the words were there. They lived in the space between them. And every day that passed without either of them addressing it, the space got smaller. Rosie was the one who finally forced the matter, with the complete disregard for adult emotional timing that only 4-year-olds can consistently achieve. It was a Sunday. Emma was sitting on the porch after lunch. Rosie climbed up into her lap without asking, the way she had started doing in the past 2 weeks. Not tentative, not checking, just doing it, because Emma's lap had become a place Rosie had decided was hers. Nathaniel came out of the house and found them there. He stopped in the doorway. Rosie looked up at him from Emma's lap. She pointed at Emma. Then she pointed at Nathaniel. Then she said, with 4-year-old clarity and complete absence of ambiguity, "Stay." The word hit the porch like a stone into still water. Emma felt her face go carefully, professionally neutral. Nathaniel looked at his daughter, then at Emma, then back at Rosie. "What did you say, Bug?" Rosie pointed at Emma again. "Stay," she said. "Emma, stay here." Nathaniel crouched down in front of them. He looked at Rosie with the focused tenderness of a man who would do anything for this child, and knew it. "You want Emma to stay?" Rosie nodded, once, with authority. "Then I'll see what I can do," Nathaniel said quietly. He looked up from Rosie to Emma, and what was in his face in that moment was not composed, not controlled, not the careful, sideways assessment she had watched him deploy for weeks. It was just true, completely and plainly true. The face of a man who had made a decision and was done pretending he hadn't. Emma held his gaze and said nothing, but she did not look away. That evening, after the children were in bed, was when it happened. Not dramatically, not the way things happened in the stories Clara was always reading, with speeches and gestures and appropriate weather. It happened in the kitchen, because that was where things always happened in this house. The real things, the things that mattered. And it happened quietly, the way real things do. Emma was writing a letter to her mother. Nathaniel came in, looked at what she was doing, and sat down across from her without speaking. She kept writing. He got his coffee. He sat. After a while, he said, "What are you telling her?" "That the lien is cleared, that she doesn't need to worry." Emma paused. "That well, are you?" She looked up. "Yes." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I've been thinking about what Rosie said." Emma set her pen down. "She's 4, Emma said carefully. "She says a lot of things." "She says very few things," Nathaniel said. "That's what makes it matter when she says them." He looked at Emma steadily. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Not carefully. Honestly." Emma waited. "Is this—" He stopped, started again. "When the 6 months are done, when there is no contract and no arrangement and nothing obligating you to any of this, is there any part of you that wants to still be here?" The kitchen was very quiet. Emma looked at this man, this honest, difficult, grief-worn, steadily recovering man who had driven her home from a thunderstorm and split kindling with unnecessary force and gone to the bank on a Monday morning and said, "I'll do what needs doing," like it cost him nothing. And she decided that she was done being careful about this particular thing. "Nathaniel," she said, "I stopped counting the days on the contract 3 weeks ago." He looked at her. "I'm not here for the contract," she said. "I haven't been for a long time. I'm here because this is the first place I've stood in 2 years that felt like ground I could build something on. I'm here because your children," her voice steadied itself, "your children are some of the finest people I have ever known, including Thomas, who made my first week extremely difficult, and I respect enormously for it." She paused. "And I'm here because you are—" She stopped. "Because I'm what?" he said quietly. "Because you're worth staying for," she said. Plain and simple. The truest sentence she'd said since she signed her name. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need filling. Nathaniel reached across the table. He covered her hand with his, not clasping it, not gripping it, just setting his hand over hers, the way you cover something you intend to keep. "I'd like to do this right," he said. Not a contract, not an arrangement. Properly. He paused. I'd like to ask your mother. Emma stared at him. You'd like to ask my mother? She should know the man her daughter is... He stopped. Something almost like color crossed his face. She should know the man who's asking. Emma thought about Catherine Callahan in the house in Millfield, with the door frame and the inability to speak, and the hands that had held Emma's whole life together, and let it go. She thought about how her mother had said, "You don't have to," and how Emma had said, "I know," and how both of them had known it wasn't true. She'll want to know if you're practical, Emma said. He blinked. What? My mother. She'll want to know if you're a practical man. She has no patience for romantic nonsense. She'll ask you directly whether you can provide, and what your land holds, and whether your roof leaks. Nathaniel looked at her. Does the roof leak? I patched it last week. Left side, above the boys' room. Emma kept her face composed. But it's fixed now. He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed. Not the managed, held-back sound she'd heard once or twice. Actually laughed. Brief and real and unpracticed. The laugh of a man who has been too serious for too long and has finally run out of reasons to stay that way. It changed his whole face. Emma stored the sight of it somewhere she intended to keep it. I'll write to her tomorrow, he said, still with the residual warmth of the laugh in his voice. Tonight, I'll work out what to say. Tell her about the roof, Emma said. She'll appreciate the detail. He shook his head slowly. You're extraordinary. You know that? I know I fixed your roof. Emma. Nathaniel. He looked at her across the table, with his hands still over hers, and his face entirely open. No angles, no sideways. Thank you, he said, for all of it, for every part of this summer, for what you did for my children, and for what you've done for me. I know it wasn't what you signed up for. It was exactly what I signed up for, Emma said. I just didn't know how to read the contract right. He pressed her hand once. Then he let it go, because he was a practical man, and there was a letter to write, and propriety to observe, and Catherine Callahan to impress, and none of that was going to accomplish itself. The community reckoning came the following Sunday. It came in the form of church, which Emma had avoided for 5 weeks, on the grounds of having too much to do and insufficient dresses, but which Nathaniel announced on Saturday evening with the quiet finality of a man who had decided it was time. He said it to the table generally. We're going to church tomorrow, everyone. And the children received this in various ways. Thomas nodded. Clara immediately began planning her dress. The twins negotiated the terms of acceptable behavior with each other in whispers. And Rosie looked at Emma and said, You too? Me too, Emma said. She was aware, driving into Silver Creek on a Sunday morning with the Holt children arranged in the wagon bed and Nathaniel sitting beside her on the seat, that they were a sight. She was aware of the heads that turned. She was aware of the full spectrum of Silver Creek opinion being applied to her, to Nathaniel, to the configuration of this family in this wagon, on this road, on this morning. She kept her chin up and her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Helen Greer was the first person to come to them after the service. She came directly, without hesitation, and she shook Nathaniel's hand, and then she turned to Emma and said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, Miss Callahan, it's good to see you. How is the household getting on? It was a declaration. Emma recognized it for what it was. A woman with standing in this community, who had been Margaret Holt's closest friend, standing in public beside Emma Callahan and asking after the Holt household with the ease of someone who had made up her mind. Very well, Emma said. The children send their regards. As do I, Mrs. Greer looked at her with a frank, direct gaze that Emma had come to understand was the woman's version of warmth. "Come by Wednesday if you can. I have a second jar of preserves and I'd like your company." "I'll be there," Emma said. Mrs. Greer moved away. Nathaniel, beside Emma, said nothing. But his arm, which had been at his side, moved to the small of her back. The briefest, lightest pressure. The kind that says, "I saw that, and well done, and I'm here," all in one gesture. Emma did not move away from it. What happened in the yard after the service was something that Emma would think about for years afterward, whenever she thought about what it meant for something to be finished. Porter's wife, not Mrs. Greer, but the other woman from the general store, the one who had directed her to the sage, stopped Emma as the crowd was dispersing. She was a small woman with a sharp face and the kind of eyes that assessed and filed and rarely forgot anything they'd filed. "Miss Callahan," she said. Emma stopped. "Ma'am?" The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "My daughter is 7. She's been having trouble with her reading. I understand you have some education?" Emma blinked. "Some, yes. I was wondering if—" The woman pressed her lips together briefly. "If you might be willing to help her? A few hours a week? She'd come to you." A pause that cost her something. "I pay for your time." Emma looked at this woman who had whispered about her in a general store, who had wondered loudly if she'd last the summer. And she thought about what it meant to be asked for something. What it meant that the asking had happened here, in this yard, in front of these people. "Bring her Thursday afternoon," Emma said. "We'll see how she takes to it." The woman nodded. She turned and went back to her husband without another word. No apology. No acknowledgement of anything prior. Just the clean, practical pivot of someone who has revised their position and is moving forward. Emma could respect that. The drive back to Silver Creek Ranch was quiet in the comfortable way, the way that has something solid underneath it instead of something avoided. The twins fell asleep against each other in the wagon bed. Clara read a book with the focused determination of someone blocking out the world. Thomas sat with his legs hanging over the back and his face turned into the summer wind. Rosie was in Emma's lap. She had climbed there without ceremony, somewhere after the 2nd mile, and settled in with Bess under her arm. And she was asleep before the 3rd mile, entirely boneless and trusting the way only children can be who have decided, completely, that the person holding them is safe. Emma looked down at this sleeping child, this small, quiet, once silent girl who had held a rag doll out to a stranger on a bedroom floor and said one word and changed everything. And felt something in her chest that she could not have put language to on the morning she'd signed her name. Something that was beyond arrangement, beyond contract, beyond any document Silas Dunmore could put a lien against. Nathaniel glanced over. He saw Emma's face looking at Rosie. He looked at the road again. "She trusts you," he said quietly. "I know." Emma's voice was soft. "I intend to deserve it." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The summer air was warm and full of the smell of dry grass and distance. "I sent the letter this morning," he said. "To your mother. Before church." Emma looked at him. "Already?" "I worked it out last night." He kept his eyes on the road. "I told her about the ranch, the children, the roof." A pause. "I told her what kind of man I am and what kind of life I have and what I'm hoping to build from here." He glanced at her sideways. "I told her I think her daughter is the strongest person I've ever met, and that I'd spend whatever time she'd give me trying to be worth standing next to." Emma looked at the road ahead, the long, flat Kansas road running straight and golden through the summer toward Silver Creek Ranch and the house on the ridge and 5 children who were hers in every way that mattered, and one man who had started slowly and honestly and without drama to be hers too. "She'll write back in 2 weeks," Emma said. "She writes slowly because she wants to get the words right." "I can wait," Nathaniel said. Emma looked at him. He was looking at the road with the settled expression of a man who means what he says. And she thought about a girl in Millfield who had pressed her hand against a piece of paper to stop it from shaking, who had signed her name on a line and thought she was giving her future away, who had ridden 40 miles in the summer heat toward a life that looked, from a distance, like nothing she would have chosen. She had not chosen it. That was the thing. She had been pushed into it by debt and hunger and a man who smiled the wrong way and thought he was buying something he could put a price on. What Silas Dunmore had not understood, what none of them had understood, not the women in the general store, not the delegation with their buckboard and their concern, not even Emma herself on that first long ride north, was that you cannot buy what Emma Callahan was. You could not arrange it or contract it or hold a lien against. You could put her in a house and give her a job and call it an arrangement, and she would fix your roof and organize your accounts and find the cast iron skillet behind the flour bin and sit on the floor with your silent daughter and wait, as long as it took, for one small word. And somewhere in the doing of it, between the sage and the storm and the kitchen table and the $300 she'd long since stopped thinking about, the house would stop being a house she was managing and start being a home she was building. She looked at the road. She looked at the man beside her and the child asleep in her arms and the 4 others strung out behind her in the wagon. She looked at Silver Creek Ranch coming into view against the summer ridge, its fence lines straight, its roof patched, its kitchen organized, its people finding their way back to each other, one small, honest moment at a time. Emma Rose Callahan had come to Silver Creek as a transaction. She stayed as the heart of it, and that was something no contract in the world could ever take back.